An organization like ours prospers by having many friends. All of our friends, both past, present, and future, will be perennial friends. We don't have annual fundraising events. We don't utter the word annual, hardly never, hardly never. Annual is out, perennials are in. And among that group are families and others who are members of what Wes would call a consecrated constituency. He would, wouldn't he? But they truly do mean so much to us. And this segment of Prairie Festival honors not only the man we all loved, and a long-standing board member of the Land Institute, Vivian Donnelly, but also the family that has helped us for a long while now. And I'd like to introduce Vivian Donnelly, please. Vivian, would you just stand for a moment, please? Strawn's wife, Vivian. And to introduce the Donnelly Lecture, Strawn's sister, Laura, is here. Laura, please come to the podium.
Thank you very morn to all of you. Some of you know that was Strawn's greeting, a very classic greeting. So yeah, this is fun and this is a little bit hard. None of us who knew Strawn really think of him as that physically gone, because he was a very potent, powerful presence in our lives. And I'm really grateful today that Wes and Joan and the board of the Land Institute, thank you so much for making this opportunity happen in such a living way. And thank you, Wendell Berry, for being the person to present the first lecture. I know it's right in the spirit of my brother, Strawn. So let's get organized here. And thank you, Vivian. She's a wonderful sister-in-law, and we've only become a richer family because of Vivian. We're really grateful for you. So you need to probably know just a little bit about Strawn, some of you who didn't know him so well, because he was really kind of a wild and crazy guy. And he and Wes Jackson had this addictive telephone thing that I don't even want to know what it was they talked about, but I know it was constant. I don't know how Joan felt about it, but it was serious business. I hear him all the time. I got to tell you, he's just always there doing a little rant here and there. I mean, I know this whole thing in the last while with BP and the chicanery of what they've been up to. And I know that he would be really disturbed lately about the sort of the green movement and how big corporations seem to have bagged the storyline, and that they're going to be packaging it up. They already are packaging it up, the big fat cats. So I know I can hear them today about that. So you got to know, we grew up in a kind of really Tolstoyan epic, our family. My father was very, very concerned. He was a businessman, and we were a family of privilege. And he and my mother were really concerned that we would grow up to be these sort of softy, country clubby type kids with no value. So we moved in the 50s to a farm north of Chicago. And my two brothers and we raised animals, went to 4-H. I learned how to garden. Strawn was this wild athlete. We lived down the road from the Rannies. Vicki Ranny is on the board. And we all went to school basically with shit on our shoes. And We didn't fit right in with those rest of those softies, and we were really actually very fine about that. We kind of liked that. But at the table, dinner time, my father, who did go into town for business, would come back, and the conversation was always about values and what we had to do to make sure that the land around us was preserved, the animals, the wetlands were restored, that to whom much is given, much is expected. That was the tone of the meal. And that's how I think Strawn came to be that person of great, the gift of generosity, of care, of real humility, although he had a good amount of brash and swagger in him, no question. But he believed very strongly in those values, and we grew up that way. And there is our little rural farms protected in that area, and a beautiful conservation development that my dad initiated that the Rannies have carried on throughout the years, Prairie Crossings. And that would not have happened were it not for those values and that constant reminder from my parents. They went on to become really quite amazing conservation protectionists in South Carolina in the Low Country. There's an area of land about 200,000 square acres, the Ace Basin, that is a kind of a connection of many large trusts and easements that are there today because my parents were so passionate. But that's how we came to be the way we are, and Strawn in particular, leading the vanguard. And I think the other thing about him is, why was he such a deeply contemplative person in his own right as a philosopher and a teacher? But I think of him best fly fishing. Fly fishing was his quiet getaway, really think about it, meditation. And it's where I believe he began to understand that humans and nature were a symbiotic relationship that could not be separated. And it was really important that he communicate this all throughout his life in all the ways he did. So he did become a philosopher, a teacher. But he would always be really comfortable, and he convened people in his foundation, his organization, humans and nature. And how simple is that? It just kind of tells it right like it is. So he and I ended up working a lot together in a family foundation where we did a lot of work with conservation, restoration. Artistic vitality is actually sort of an interwoven piece of all that too, because once land is gone, it doesn't come back. And the minute some social concern comes up, the arts are out the window. And they really, it's important to have the arts and artists in the mix and in the discussion. There's no question. So humans and nature, how do we as a human society live ethically and responsibly in a dynamic balance with nature? How do we honor our environments without bending them to our will? As if, that can really ultimately happen. And most profoundly, how do we celebrate and be in awe of the natural world? That was Strawn. So thank you, Strawn brother. I think it's time for Wendell. Thanks.
I'll let most of the introducers introduce themselves, but the young man that I'm going to introduce right now, who will tell you about the works of Wendell Berry, is special to us. He is the Kansas State Department of Agriculture Director. He is a person that was elected to the House of Representatives several times from this area. He's a Democrat. So the Secretary of Agriculture from the state of Kansas, Josh Swati.
It is a difficult thing to introduce someone that everyone is here to listen to. However, Ken, you made my life easier because by introducing me as a Democrat, it automatically puts me in a class like the Topeka Shiner or the Neosho clams and mussels. I'm an endangered species. Everyone cares about what I'm up to. Our speaker needs no biographical introduction. I thought I would just share a few thoughts. 2 days ago, I had the opportunity to attend another conference in Kansas City on sustainability in agriculture, hosted by the Kansas City Agribusiness Council. And the general consensus from that day and those meetings was that modern agriculture is more sustainable now than it has ever been in its history. And I almost actually called up Joan and said, stop the Perennial on the Horizon campaign. Let's rename it Perennials on the Horizon, What's the Point? It could be really just a whole new direction. But one of the speakers in particular was very interesting because she spoke about how the people on the coasts just don't get it. And that is a refrain we hear almost all the time. People in agriculture get together. But this was particularly snarky. And she had no intention of the people on the coast and the people not engaged in agriculture in understanding it at all. And although she didn't use this exact wordage, it was clear that she felt that we spoke a different language than what they spoke on the coast or people that are not engaged in agriculture. And it led me to want to share a few words from our next speaker. And these are not actually from his writing, but from an interview that he did several months ago. I thought I'd share those with you. I think often of the importance of language spoken by people who are really local, who really know where they are and have lived there a long time. That language has a particularity about it that no language of bureaucracy or government or the university can ever have. It has a designating power that's utterly precise. Knowing the landscape in common and knowing it intimately, minutely, that has to be the basis of a language. That is where it starts, and you can raise it up from there in successive levels of abstraction. But if you lose that power to particularize and designate precisely, in some sense, you don't have a language anymore. So having a common tongue can mean that at one level, you have the dictionary in common, you have the English vocabulary. But to have a common tongue in the sense that you can speak in detail, knowledgeably and responsibly, about a well-known place, a well-known ecosystem, and a well-known human community is quite another thing. Our speaker this morning hails from Henry County, Kentucky, a place I have never visited. I do not speak its language. My family has farmed in Ellsworth County, where I live, just west of here, for 5 generations. I have my own language, and I think very few of you here have probably ever been to Henry County, Kentucky. But this morning I want you to think about the apostles in the book of Acts when they were lit with fire from above and could suddenly speak languages that the entire world could understand. This morning it is our great pleasure to have with us a speaker and a writer who has been gifted to be able to speak a language that everyone can understand. Ladies and gentlemen, Wendell Berry.
Thank you, Josh. I hoped for the full 15 minutes, but it's all right. And I feel permitted to consider that I speak under the sign of the Kansas Department of Agriculture. It's a great honor to feel that I speak under the sign of Strawn Donnelly, who I appreciated very much and valued and Ms. And it's an honor to be again at the Land Institute, which is a place I can think about and put my mind at rest. The first time I spoke here, it was 30 years ago. It'll be 30 years in December. I began by quoting my fellow Kentuckian, Irvin S. Cobb, to the effect that he would rather be an orphan in Kentucky than twins in Kansas. I had some doubt about whether that was properly appreciated or not. And so I'm referring to him again because the point was, of course, that people in Kansas ought to feel in reverse exactly the same thing. That is to say, that we ought to love our own states and our own home places better than any others. That is our duty. But to love our own places is to recognize, or it ought to be, that other people love their places better than they love ours. This, too, is our duty. If we love our places, if we recognize that other people love their places, then maybe it is also our duty to refrain from bombing or in any way harming any place. Our own or anybody else's. So I'm speaking here as a Kentuckian, as I should. My remarks come in response to a book about the natural heritage of Kentucky, the first such book, the first such accounting that's ever been attempted as far as I know. My talk then deals with certain scraps of the history of my own people. When we consider all that we have lost, ruined, or squandered since our forebears, if they weren't Indians, came to live in our place, this place, Kentucky, only 235 years ago, we have to conclude that as a people, we Kentuckians have had only a vague and feckless sense of where we are. Though we have had sufficient time and opportunities, we have failed to develop an effective culture of land stewardship. Efforts and lineages of stewardship have persisted among us from the time of our arrival until now. But any form of land conservation has been a minor theme, almost conventionally overpowered by some form of land exploitation. There are reasons for this, and we should take care to understand them. Now, I'm doing this with the knowledge that in some ways this overlaps with your history and the history of your place wherever you come from. In some places it doesn't. To begin at the beginning, our ancestors came here necessarily as strangers. They knew more or less where they had come from, maybe. They didn't know where they were when they got here. They had heard of a rich and abounding land to the west, understandably an attraction to people in need of land or of some variety of a new start. Some came hoping predictably for a lot of something, for a little expense or a little effort. Some came looking like some of their descendants for something indefinitely better. Some came because land they had ruined in the east would no longer support them. Some came for adventure or to escape. Some, more honorably, came for a place to settle in and stay. But all came, almost inevitably, to impose on this place some preconceived wish or demand formed in the place they had left. In the best of circumstances, authentic settlement of this new country would have been difficult. To know a place and to use it well takes a long time and a lengthy practice of observation, forbearance, temperance, caution, and affection. Opposed to the motive of settlement would always be the motives of the speculator, the swindler, and the exploiter. It was at the beginning a country that had looked vast in its abundance, limitlessly so. How could so much ever be used up? Inevitably accompanying the wish to live within bounds and take care of what you had was that other wish, still predominantly with us, to take from the land as much as you could get of whatever you wanted, charge it to nature or your neighbor or the future, and move on. Like the rest of our country, moreover, our state was settled by a people historically unsettled. The first would-be settlers came here because they were unsettled, unwilling or unable for a variety of reasons to stay put. And what we would now call social mobility has continued and worsened here until now. We came in the process of moving on with the frontier, and for that reason many settlers settled here only temporarily. And by the time the newcomers were arriving in Kentucky on foot or horseback or by drifting down the Ohio River, the Industrial Revolution was already beginning. The steam engine was patented in 1769, 6 years before the settlements at Harrodsburg and Boonesboro. By 1811, steamboat navigation was beginning on the Ohio River. Increasingly up to the Civil War, and ever more rapidly after that, industrialism provided a second option for the unsettled. They could move laterally westward, or they could move up to a city job, better wages, or a salary and a white shirt. For Kentuckians, moving up has often required moving out, and the state's education system has in general subserved and encouraged the impulse of movement. Kentucky schools have functioned somewhat as factories, processing young people for export from country to city and from Kentucky to other states. Our educational system has educated least of all for settlement, or for what Wes Jackson has called homecoming. Often explicitly, almost always by implication, the theme of education in Kentucky has been, you don't want to be just a farmer, or you can't amount to anything by staying here. There has never been much likelihood that a student in Kentucky schools from grade 1 through college would learn anything of local history or local geography or local biology and ecology. The idea of growing up to a life's work on a family farm or in a family profession or trade in a hometown might come from your family or a known example. You were not likely to receive it from a school. Because we have seen no virtue in education for settlement, we have drifted easily into job training in service to the industrial corporations, most of which have been by principle dislocated and without loyalty to any place. So displacing an idea of education with its cult of science and technology did not arise among us by chance. Its way was prepared by the displacing religion that we brought here with us, a religion already long divorced from even the biblical concerns with economy and economic behavior, the daily housekeeping by which we make our livings and our lives. The history of religion in Kentucky is impossible to make sense of. Along with our eagerness to secure earthly places for ourselves, deeded boundaries that would belong to us, our heirs, and assigns forever, we brought along this juiceless and desiccating Protestantism, mostly, that deferred all sanctity and worth to heaven. It was a strictly spiritual religion that made a pride of despising the earth and earthly life. This had the odd result, not at all accountable in terms of religion, of making our earthly life and economy strictly materialistic. The materialistic force of the industrial economy has thus been able to exploit a territory in effect abandoned by religion. The history of materialism in Kentucky, as elsewhere, is also impossible to make sense of. For how could this modern materialism, resting upon its supposedly enlightened sciences and ascribing ultimate value to matter, have become so utterly destructive of the material world? Given our histories of settlement and unsettlement, of a displacing education, subordinating everything to upward mobility, and a disembodying religion aspiring only to heaven, it would be surprising indeed if we had developed a state politics and government encouraging to good stewardship of the land. On the contrary, our politicians have aligned state government with a national government, increasingly dominated by the great corporations, and subserving a land-destroying economy that has become so conventional that government officers and university intellectuals scarcely have thought even to question it. If our state government in Frankfurt is different, it is so only by exaggeration in, for example, its virtual enslavement to the coal industry. The history of the coal economy in Kentucky is the extreme instance that bespeaks our general failure to acquire any effective knowledge of where we are, or any effective sense of the good care we owe to the land we once were so fortunate to come to in our need. This history proves that industrial corporations will stop at nothing, will do anything to achieve the highest possible income at the lowest possible cost. It proves at the same time the unwillingness of our people and our politicians to set limits and impose restraints upon any gigantic economic power. In the official political and academic view, the economy of Kentucky has no connection with the land of Kentucky. This is the definition of a lethal economic disease. To live, we depend unconditionally upon our membership in the community of creatures, living and not living, that we call the ecosphere. Every life in the terrestrial ecosphere depends unconditionally in turn upon a thin layer of fertile topsoil, which in most places is a few inches or a few feet deep and which accumulates slowly. In a climate such as ours, it deepens by perhaps 1 inch in 1,000 years. This layer of topsoil is made by the decay of rock, by sunlight and rain, and by the life and death of all the creatures, but mainly of the plants, mainly of perennial plants, forest or grassy sod that grow from it, die into it, and by covering it year-round protect it from erosion and hold it in place. Now that paragraph delineates a disaster. It's a disaster that those things even need to be said to anybody. About the topsoil, the creatures that inhabit it, from the microorganisms to the tallest trees and their complex interdependencies, we humans know very little, and we are unlikely to know very much. We do know, we seem always to have known that upon this great gift, this great mystery, we and all our generations absolutely depend. The Bible, as some have begun again to understand, requires our gratitude for this gift, as well as our care and caution in the use of it. To forget this, so as to destroy the topsoil and the plant cover that protects it, surely is a desecration, if desecration means anything at all. And yet our present economy is based upon this forgetfulness and this desecration, which are formalized in all our industries of land use and which culminate in mountaintop removal mining in the Appalachian coal fields. In A Darkness at Dawn, published 40 years ago, Harry M. Caudle wrote, "No one in government complained that whole communities of people and entire mountain ranges with their infinitely complex ecology had been sacrificed." This is mostly still true, though the damage by now is inconceivably worse. Mountaintop removal, which destroys entirely the original biotic community and replaces it with a flimsy scrim of exotic plants, is the perfect antithesis of the native abundance of the land that lay before those uprooted strangers who came purportedly to settle in 1775. It took us only a little more than 200 years to pass from intentions sometimes approximately good to this horrible result, in which our education, our religion, our politics, and our daily lives all are implicated. This is original sin, round 2. It is necessary to say further that the same economy of production by exhaustion is at work only more slowly in our landscapes that are forested or farmed. The state and national and now global economies pay only for production from these landscapes, not for the best work. Well, there you are. See, I'm not the least bit paranoid. Several years ago, I got honored by the Rural Electric Cooperative at home, and then I started talking bad about them and imparted to an action to stop the construction of a power plant, and so this is no accident. Let's see, I'll continue. The state and national and now global economies pay only for production from these landscapes, not for the best work, not for maintenance. The land still produces, but it does so at an ever-increasing, unlimited, and unrestrained cost in soil erosion, chemical pollution, community destruction, degradation of the cultures of husbandry, and now in reduction of the land-using population almost to disappearance. Perhaps the most tragic irony of our history was in the industrialization of agriculture after World War II. Now, the timetable for different places would be a little different from this, but very much it happened in Kentucky after World War II. In the mid-1940s, an ecological standard for land use had been made available by the work of ecologists such as Aldo Leopold and agriculturists such as Sir Albert Howard and J. Russell Smith. The work of these men and their colleagues had been widely recognized and their writing published in books and reputable journals. But at the same time, industries that had grown rich and powerful in support of the war effort were faced with disemployment. The solution to this problem was to, now here I've been monkeying with my manuscript while the lights were off. The solution to this problem was to industrialize agriculture. The machines and chemicals developed to defeat foreign enemies were turned against the farmland and the farmers on the home front. The aim of industrialization then, as always, was to replace and to displace human workers with more efficient technologies. This project was abetted and justified by the Committee for Economic Development, whose experts decreed that there were too many farmers. The surplus farmers, supposedly not needed for land maintenance and stewardship, and as mere producers readily replaceable by machines and chemicals, were needed instead as new members of the industrial workforce to keep wages under control and as consumers to increase the market for food and other industrial products. Any possibility that agriculture could be structured according to ecological models adapted to localities was abandoned and forgotten. Imposing everywhere the same methods, technologies, varieties, and breeds without respect to place Industrial agriculture acquired with astonishing speed the stature and force of a national and by now a global orthodoxy, solidly supported by government departments of agriculture, the land-grant colleges of agriculture, agricultural journalism, and large grants of money and extensive advertising by the agri-industrial corporations. And so it was just tough luck for small farmers, small farms, small fields, fences, shrubby fence rows, grassed waterways, wetlands, farm woodlands, clean streams, native communities of plants and animals, and incalculable tonnages of eroded topsoil. Tough luck, in short, for the natural heritage and the ecological underpinnings of the economic landscapes of Kentucky, as of the whole nation. Though it was granted the justification of a hireling science and the standard of a purely financial and mechanical efficiency, there was in fact no excuse, scientific or political or moral, for this all-out industrial transformation of agriculture. But there was a lot of money in it for the corporations, for research and development, for universities. A lot of money, that is, for everybody but farmers. For a brief interlude after about 1940, the agricultural economy was favorable to farmers, who enjoyed even a bit of prestige and appreciation during the war years. But in 1952, the Eisenhower administration came in, issuing to farmers maybe the cruelest, most undemocratic proclamation ever made to American citizens: get big or get out. Farmers were then abandoned to the mercy of the industrial economy and the free market, which in only 40 or so years squeezed most of them out of farming and into the labor pool. Their places were taken to some extent by migrant workers, predictably disesteemed and exploited, but mostly by mechanical and chemical technologies and fossil fuels that greatly increased costs for the remaining farmers, costs that invariably increased faster than farm income. The idea that farmers should be conservationists has been fairly commonplace since at least the 1930s, and it is a fact to some extent not acknowledged that the survival of agriculture depends upon the conservation of nature. But too few experts and officials have realized that conservation in agriculture requires an adequate number of farmers adequately paid. You can't expect a minimal farm population, minimally paid, and struggling for survival to be devoted conservationists. The power and wealth of agriculture has accrued more and more to the corporations, less and less to the primary producers. Meanwhile, because of the growth of urban populations and increasing specialization in production, the geographic basis of the food economy has grown more and more extensive. For a long time, the economies of agriculture and food have been dependent on long-distance transportation. One of the significant unaccounted costs of long-distance transportation has been the rapid, accidental, but inevitable spread of exotic organisms. Our present version of industrial agriculture, then, has incidentally produced two dire ecological results. It has destroyed or damaged local communities of native species, and it has supplanted or corrupted them with introduced diseases, weeds, and pests. When the accounting is finally done, these results will be shown to be too expensive, both ecologically and economically, initially damaging and difficult or impossible to put right. And so the history of our state, inseparable in most ways from the history of our nation, has brought us in a short time to an economy that is increasingly tremulous and questionable, resting, though most economists evidently are unaware, upon ecosystems that are increasingly impaired and threatened. That is the history, and those are the circumstances in which the University Press of Kentucky and a staff of committed authors and editors have given us this book called Kentucky's Natural Heritage. This is both a publication and an event of inestimable significance. It could hardly be more needed, or more welcome to Kentuckians who have at heart the health and the real wealth of their state. No book that I have read has helped me so much to think about the land of Kentucky, of the reciprocity of influence and the sharing of fate between the land and ourselves. This book is an appraisal within acknowledged limits. It is an inventory, and it is inescapably a history. It gives us a competent sense of the state's native health and abundance before our arrival, of what and how much we have lost or wasted or used up, and of what is left. Differences heartbreaking to think about. And so this book also is inescapably a lamentation. It is an ambitious book, for it does what has never been attempted before. It is also properly modest. The authors acknowledge on the first page of the first chapter that their work provides only a glimpse. They return again and again to one of the book's most telling themes: how much is not yet known, how much we need to know that we must endeavor to learn. We must see this book, then, as a monument, marking the starting point of a great and fascinating task. It is an excellent beginning, for it sets the agenda for further work and tells us how to carry it on. If we live up to what this book does for us and asks of us, we eventually will gather such knowledge of every region of our state, every county, every natural and human neighborhood, every leased watershed, every farm, woodland, and field. We will do the work and the study that this requires because we will know the time is rapidly approaching when we will have to know that our lives depend upon such an effort. Upon such knowledge rests the work of local adaptation, of fitting our economy to the demands of ecological health, without which no species can survive for long. This obviously calls for a system of education oriented to localities, to preparing people to live and to make their livings in places naturally distinct and in ways that will enhance the natural and human health of those places. To reorient education in this way does not mean that we will cease to teach the sciences, the liberal arts, and the enduring works of human culture, but we will add to those the arts and sciences of ecological restoration, land stewardship, and husbandry. We will teach the whole curriculum with the understanding that the most reliable and the ultimate standard of success is the health and beauty of the land. The most fundamental and necessary change will be in the teaching of biology. There will need to be a new emphasis on what used to be known as natural history. Colleges and universities will need to staff the elementary and high schools with competent field biologists, practical naturalists, who will lead their students outdoors, teaching them to read the history and present condition of their home landscapes and to know something of the composition of biotic communities. Such teaching would foster the hope that economic responsibility and ecological responsibility might become a single practice. Students would thus be prepared for the work of local adaptation, which, because the world changes, would be ongoing, never quite complete. They might learn at least to see what is most obvious, that the habitat of every creature in our home countryside is also our habitat, and to make it less inhabitable for other creatures will finally make it less inhabitable for us. And I think because we've got delayed and it's getting on toward dinner time, that I'll quit. There's some more of this, but and I haven't heard my what? I always have an eye for the good excuses, but look, Wes says to go on. It has by now become my obligation to speak of these things as an elder. I've been collecting memories and observations of my home neighborhood in Henry County for 75 years, or about a third of the 235 years since the founding of Harrodsburg and Boonesboro. If I add to my own memory the voices of my grandparents, who also lived their lives in this place, telling me their memories of it, then I have a living memory of more than half the span of the modern history of Kentucky. My knowledge of this place, thus gathered, is entirely concordant with the plot of this book. It is the story with a few uptilts of what the book calls an unfortunate state of decline. On the positive side, there are many more trees here now than there were at the time of my birth. Beginning early in our history, the steep valley sides of the Kentucky River and its tributaries were cleared and row-cropped. The trees were cut, the litter burned, the slopes broken with jumper plows, the rocks piled, a crop planted and harvested. This was repeated until erosion and depletion put an end to the cycle, and then the trees were allowed to grow back, and it could be started again, according to my friend Tim Taylor, in about 40 or 50 years. This was the worst sort of farming, but the blame for it is hard to distribute justly. It was, of course, done varyingly in ignorance by the farmers, for almost nobody so far has tried to devise a conserving use for these marginal lands. But hard use was enforced by the usually adverse markets for agricultural products. Almost nobody so far has tried to understand how a bad agricultural economy affects the land. Desperate people would try the hopeless expedient of plowing their way out of debt, or they would overproduce row crops to compensate for low prices that were the result of overproduction. By about the time of World War II, probably because so many of the young men had gone to war or to factory jobs, this plowing of the steeper slopes was given up. The forest has been growing back now for 2 generations or more. But if you walk those slopes today, you will find under the trees the old cropland gullies, some healed, some still eroding. With the return of the woods, there have been some significant returns of wildlife. Deer and wild turkeys, long gone before my time, have been reintroduced again and are present in large numbers. Beavers and otters, also absent in my early years, are here again. The last few years, bald eagles have been nesting a few miles upriver from my house, and sometimes I see one from my window. Besides the reforestation of the slopes, the other great changes in the landscape here has occurred in the pastures. From a time not long after our people came, the pasture grass predominant everywhere was bluegrass, which supplanted the canebrakes and the native grasses of the savannas. This seems to have been a fairly benign succession, Leopold thought it was, for bluegrass and the naturalized European white clover that lived symbiotically with it, along with the many other wild plants that would come naturally to the pastures, were hospitable to the native animals and birds. The buffalo and elk and their predators were gone, but smaller creatures throve. And then in the 1950s, bluegrass began rapidly to be supplanted by fescue, introduced by the University of Kentucky. This was a taller, coarser grass, excellent for erosion control, but far less palatable to livestock, in some ways dangerous to livestock, and not hospitable to wildlife. It makes a denser sod than bluegrass, and grants less passage to the runways of small mammals and ground-traveling birds, such as the bobwhite. Though the bobwhite survives in some places for many years, I have not heard its much-loved voice at my own place in the river valley. Rotary mowing machines may be partly to blame for such diminishments, as also perhaps for an apparent decline in the population of snakes, such as the black rat snake. Such changes inevitably accompany also the continuous row cropping of corn and soybeans in the wider valley bottoms. I'm not a trained biologist or even a trained observer, and so I'm speaking only of larger changes, obvious to anybody who has been here so many years and remained fairly alert. During most of my life, for another example, the elm trees have been dying, and I have witnessed and regretted the disappearance of many a great old landmark, just as generations before me witnessed the disappearance of the Carolina parakeets, the passenger pigeons, and the chestnut trees. Maybe the biggest surprise to me in the history of disappearances was to learn of the disappearance from everywhere but the oldest and largest forest of the native earthworms. The fishing worms I used to dig, assuming they were as native as the ground itself, all are exotics, imported with potted plants or in the ballast of ships. Paul Kalis of the University of Kentucky Department of Forestry told me this not too many years ago, and I was shocked. This is one of my most unfinished and troubling thoughts, for it shows how much I've taken the world for granted and how far too little I have thought about what is not obvious. To the weeds of cropland and pasture that our people were complaining about when I was young, we have added nodding thistle, Canada thistle, Johnson grass, multiflora rose, and in the river bottoms, Japanese hops. Not so long ago, when you stepped from the open fields into the woods, just about anywhere along the valley sides, you would be in the ancient community of the native plants. Now you will often find nearly solid stands of Japanese grass or garlic mustard. Among the native trees, vines, and shrubs, you will now find Japanese honeysuckle, bush honeysuckle, tree of heaven, and again, multiflora rose. Another official introduction. Among other animate exotics, we have recently acquired Japanese beetles and a small ladybug-like beetle that lives exuberantly in people's houses, both serious pests. We have had European starlings and English sparrows since long before my time. More recently have come the house finch and the coyote. How all these newcomers, including us humans, will finally settle here, become integrated into the communities of native creatures, and so at last become native themselves, is a question involving many questions. We will be trying to answer them much longer than we have been here. Two further disappearances are of particular interest to me because they show so well the carelessness of our economic life and our consequent vulnerability to unintended consequences. Fairly recently, the native black willows that used to be common along the banks of the Kentucky River have nearly disappeared. A few remain here and there, but always high up at or near bank top. They have entirely disappeared along the low water line, where they granted to the river a characteristic grace and beauty and undoubtedly helped to control riverbank erosion. I have found nobody who can explain their absence, and only the older fishermen seem to have noticed it. Something obviously is wrong. Is it a toxic pollutant in the water? We need to know, but who is asking? Another disappearance, also important, is that of the black dung beetles that we knew as tumblebugs. Throughout my childhood, and I think until the late 40s or early 50s, you would find these interesting creatures rolling their dung balls along the dusty paths of any cow pasture. They were burying the cow manure in which they laid their eggs and on which their larvae fed. Why did they disappear? Though I had a sort of theory, I wanted scientific authority, and so I presented my question to an entomologist in the College of Agriculture at the University of Kentucky. I've been pondering his answer for the last 30 or so years. I don't know anything about them, but I can tell you this: they have no economic significance. Well, that answer showed how conventionally submissive science can be to economic significance. Also, how conventionally economic significance could be equated with already known economic significance. Also, how conventionally indifferent agricultural science could be to ecological significance. Since then, I have found nobody who can tell me why the tumblebugs have disappeared. My own unscientific guess is that they disappeared because of some medication we were using on the cattle, probably a wormer. But how can the disappearance of an insect that buries manure be economically insignificant? Again, I'm reduced to an unscientific guess, but as I remember, the departure of the tumblebugs more or less coincided with an epidemic increase in the population of so-called face flies, which breed in manure piles. Face flies, in addition to their pestering of farm animals, are a major cause of pink eye in cattle, which in turn can cause blindness and which requires expensive treatment. If I'm guessing right, the tumblebugs themselves were economically significant, and so was their disappearance. Furthermore, if I'm right, this is an example not merely of an agriculturally caused agricultural problem, but also of the impossibility of separating economic significance from ecological significance. The disappearance of the willows, since I can't even guess at the cause, I attribute generally and vaguely to the industrialization and therefore the contamination of nearly everything. The disappearance of the tumblebugs can be attributed more specifically, if still vaguely, to the industrialization of agriculture. Both disappearances show us how inescapably we are members, for better or worse, of what Aldo Leopold called the land community. I have spoken of changes in the populations of non-human species in my neighborhood during my lifetime. And now I must add that the changes in the human population have been at least as extreme. Through World War II, the local humans were only marginally industrialized. The farms were mostly small, mostly solar-powered by way of the bodies of people and animals, and highly diverse. Households in both town and country were sustained this side of the corporate markets by a variety of home manufactures and of foods raised and prepared at home. Most of the economic life was conducted at home or in local shops, stores, and offices. For the most part, people lived where they worked. By now, these rural places have become mostly bedroom communities for people who work in Louisville or Frankfurt. Most economic life is conducted away from home. The old subsistence economy with its many skills has about vanished. The farms are larger, the farmers fewer, and much of the physical work is done by migrant laborers. The human population and all its activities are entirely dependent on purchased energy from fossil fuels. Milk cows and dairies are almost all gone, and so are almost all of the sheep, hogs, and poultry. The decline of wildlife diversity has been accompanied by the decline of domestic species and varieties. In sum, the land community, in need more than ever of the attention of its human members, has now far fewer knowledgeable observers, users, and caretakers than it had 50 or 60 years ago. My neighborhood then, like neighborhoods all over Kentucky, is a naturally rich place, long in decline toward ecological poverty, and if it continues, toward economic poverty as well. The publication of this book, as I hope my response to it shows, is an occasion on which the need for hope becomes urgent. The news from the land under our feet is not good, but the most hopeless thing we can do is ignore it or pretend it is not so bad. As I've been thinking about this book, I've been asking myself once again, what are our authentic reasons for hope? Here is my list. As this book suggests, we can learn where we are. We can look around us and see. If we see by many observable signs that during our history here we have lost much that we once had, we will see also that much remains. We will see furthermore that we are not helpless. Two great powers, if we will align themselves with them and use them, are in our favor. They are land health and conservation. Land health, Aldo Leopold wrote, is the capacity of the land for self-renewal. And, he said, conservation is our effort to understand and preserve that capacity. Land health we have still with us. In most places in our state, we can prove this just by stopping a gully. Leopold proved it by reforesting an exhausted farm. Wherever the ground is covered with perennial plants, and we can help with this, it is preserved from erosion. It conserves water. It offers year-round benefits to us and also to other creatures. It has healed. It is well. If the ground is covered by native perennials, it is even better. There is hope in seeing what we need to do and in doing it. A part of our necessary work is conservation, and there is hope in knowing that conservation is already going on. Conservation in various forms has been an established effort in the United States since at least the beginning of the last century. But it was going on a long time before that, wherever the land was used frugally, skillfully, and with affection. There would be hope in effective public leadership if we had it. But ecological degradation is not a political issue in Kentucky. It is not much a political issue in the nation. And I don't see any help coming very soon from leaders in education. What I do see, and I see great hope in it, is what we could call leadership from the bottom. This is coming from individuals and local groups who, without official permission or support or knowledge, are seeing what needs to be done and are doing it. Admirable work in sustainable agriculture, sustainable forestry, local economy, land preservation and restoration, and other kinds of conservation is being done all over the place by unofficial people. Some larger, more formal citizens' organizations are also doing good work. They're worth contributing to, working for, and criticizing. Some things are changing for the better, and there's hope in knowing this. Minds, lives, even policies can change for the better. History gives us some reason to think that a whole culture can change for the better. That is what we're hoping and working for. Too much of the talk and politics of conservation consists of slogans such as think locally or think globally, act locally, or even single words such as green or sustainable or organic that act like slogans. Such language finally does harm. It becomes useful, in fact, to land-abusing corporations. What gives hope is actual conversation, actual discourse, in which people say to one another in good faith, fully and exactly what they know, and acknowledge honestly the limits of their knowledge. Maybe the finest of all sources of hope are the people for whom the effort of conservation has ceased to be a separate activity and has come to be at one with their ways of making their living. Some foresters, farmers, and ranchers have achieved this. They have not achieved perfection, of course, but they have achieved a kind of unity of vision and of work. For them, land health is not something added to their economy, but is their economy's basis and its result, indistinguishable from it, and that, in fact, is all. The end. Thank you.